name's Brandon Wilson, and I'm here today as the Executive Director for the Somerville Historic Preservation Commission. Today we are leading, along with East Somerville Main Street, a walking tour. And we will be starting here at the library and then going down the hill, Central Hill, to Gilman Square and Walnut Street, and then on over through Broadway to East Somerville proper. We have great attendance. It looks like we have a lot of people here. It's a great day for a walking tour, and we are handing out brochures to everybody. If you're not able to be on this tour and are watching this on TV, then we encourage you to go to our website to download the brochure that we're handing out today, and you can do it as a self-guided tour at any point in time that you'd like. And if you need more information, feel free to call our office at City Hall. We're the Historic Preservation Commission, and we're under the boards and commission. Thanks. One of the reasons we do this tour is so that people can be introduced to all of the assets and the changes that have been occurring in East Somerville over a long period of time, going back 300 years. With me here today is Christy Chase, who is the Preservation Planner staff for the Preservation Commission. So you know, the Preservation Commission is a 14-member body. They serve as volunteers, all because the labor of love. And we have at least one of our members here today. George Bourne was, there he is, okay. George Bourne is an architectural historian, representative on the commission. He also lives in East Somerville. So if you have lots of questions, please go to him. There are some other members that will be here later, I think. Okay, so today's tour is a little different than we've done before. I see a lot of familiar faces and know that a number of you have been on our tours before. We welcome you coming back. And also we do them in East Somerville each year. I think we've done about 8 or 9 of them now. But this year, in order to keep it fresh and a little different, we're not actually starting in East Somerville, as you probably gathered. This is more Central Hill. And so we're going to start here and walk down the hill to Gilman Square area via Walnut Street. And then we're going to go back to Walnut Street over to Broadway, which is considered, at this point, Winter Hill for most people who live in the neighborhood. But then we're going to approach East Somerville from the west, which is Winter Hill, technically, going into East Somerville, and then spend a little bit of time there today. So it's, as I said, a little different than what we've done in the past, but I think it's also an important area, Gilman Square, to talk about, because if you haven't already heard, the Green Line is coming. And first it's going to Union Square, but then next it will be extended out all the way to Tufts University, but on the way it's going to go into Gilman Square. So we're doing a lot of transit planning in the Gilman Square area, and so again that's going through a lot of changes, and that will probably continue as a transitional neighborhood. So one of the reasons we want to do this today is to explore it a little bit before those changes occur. So if you have questions during the tour, please feel free to talk to any of us, Carrie, myself, Christy, Ed, and George. And also you can reach any of us through the website or the online as well. So I'm going to now introduce Ed Gordon, who, for those of you that have done this tour before, know him well. We keep bringing him back because he's so good. He has done a lot of architectural surveying for us going back to 2005, I think. And these tours are an outcome of the surveying work that he did. He just did some more recent surveys for us in Gilman Square for the reasons I explained. He is also the president of the New England chapter of the Victorian Society in America. So he's handed out some orange sheets, if you're wondering where those came from, on behalf of his other organization. But I want to welcome Ed today. Thank you. And he will be taking over from here.
Okay. Well, today our touring through Eastern Winter Hill and East Somerville, where our common theme is transportation. And both these neighborhoods share several transportation innovations. First of all, the tour is bracketed by rangeways, Cross Street and Walnut Street. And what these rangeways were, they were interior roadways or paths that linked the Elm Street, Somerville Ave, Washington Street corridor, what was called Milk Row way back in the 18th and into the early 19th century, linking Milk Row with Broadway. And so these rangeways provided access to interior agricultural and dairy farms, and they were 24 feet wide. There were 8 of them between Franklin Street and where the old Powder House is in Powder House Park, and then 3 more west of the Powder House as far as North Street, paralleling Alewife Brook. So these are fairly distinctive transportation features that Somerville had way back. Also, these 2 neighborhoods share Broadway, which was set out as early as 1636, linking Charlestown, which of course Somerville was originally part of, with Menotomy, now known as Arlington. And part of Broadway was the route that Paul Revere took on his famous midnight ride on the night of April 18th and 19th, 1775. And then fast forwarding a bit to 1803, when the Middlesex Canal is completed, the Middlesex Canal ran through Somerville. And so this was a 27-mile canal that linked the Merrimack River Valley in what is now Lowell, but then Chelmsford, with Charlestown. So it started up by the Merrimack River, and it continued, ending in what is now Sullivan Square. And on the sort of Cambridge side of Sullivan Square, there was a basin for the canal boats, what was part of Charles River Bay. And this brings up the point that Somerville and Cambridge were much more separate because of this indentation by Charles River Bay, as well as the Millers River, which extended into the Union Square section of Somerville. So the Middlesex Canal was primarily a waterway that's more concerned with conveying agricultural produce and building materials like granite and lumber. For example, the granite that built University Hall at Harvard Yard, Harvard University, came down through the Middlesex Canal in the early 18 teens. Yes, there was a passenger component to the Middlesex Canal, but it seems like it was, by all accounts, used by folks who were going picnicking, using the canal to get to the Mystic Lakes and Horn Pond and Winchester. So it was more about transporting produce and building materials, and maybe a little bit less about passengers. The canal came to an end in the early 1850s, and this was brought about by the coming of the railroad in the mid-1830s. The Boston and Lowell Railroad, which we'll talk about shortly, as early as 1836. And so the railroads provide more rapid, faster, efficient moving of products and people than the canals ever could. The canal was also difficult to maintain in the New England climate, this constant freezing and unfreezing, and having to constantly clean the debris out of the canal in the late fall and all that kind of thing. So, and there isn't too much evidence of the canal left today, except in parts of Woburn and Billerica and other parts of eastern Middlesex County. But it did, when it started to come into Charlestown, it did a dip down into what is now Foss Park, almost to Broadway, and then took a northeastward thrust along the northern lower slopes of Mount Benedict, where the Ursuline convent was located, now where the States Avenue section of East Somerville is located today. And then it continued into Sullivan Square. Okay. Right now, I just want to mention that we're also beginning at a library and ending at a library, beginning at the main branch of the Somerville Public Library and ending at the East East Somerville branch. It's not that long a walk. So we're looking at the main branch of the Somerville Public Library here, if we could turn our attention, which was built in 1914 from designs provided by Edward Lippincott Tilton. And Tilton got his start working for the renowned architectural firm of McKim, Mead, and White. And it's no accident that this building looks like a little bit later version of the Boston Public Library at Copley Square, because Tilton actually was sort of a draftsman on that project for McKim. And so what you have here is an Italian Renaissance Revival building, which is very much echoing the BPL at Copley Square, particularly on the second floor, where you have that range of arched windows that illuminate the second floor reading room up there. These arched windows are actually coming more from mid-19th century French institutional design. In other words, there was a French architect named Théodore Labrouste who specialized in libraries and hospitals. And often on the second floor of those French institutional buildings, there was this range of arched windows. But the Renaissance Revival really comes in quite strongly at the cornice, where you can see the dental course first above where it's in size, the Somerville Public Library. The dental course, dentals, literally that's a reference to dental work, to teeth. They almost do look like teeth up there. And then above that, the egg and dart molding, which is going way back to ancient Greece, but the Romans and the Renaissance designers picked up on this. The egg and the dart. The egg stands for the birth of a human being, and the arrow, death. And then above that are these wonderful brackets, and then the cornice itself at the top. So very handsome building, built of yellow tannish brick. And this brings up the point that from the time of the Chicago World's Fair onward, you have this getting away from the so-called brown decades of earlier Victorian times with all that dark brownstone and dark red brick, and getting into lighter coloration of materials. And so at the BPL in Copley Square, you have granite, you have Milford granite. Here, I think the city of Somerville didn't want to get into really expensive granite materials, so they're still giving us light-colored masonry here in the tan brick. So it's this move away from the darker stone colors. Okay, let's start our walk. I think, no?
Sorry. I just a couple more announcements I just want to make. One, I'm very pleased to say that the ward alderman for Ward 1 is here today. Matt McLaughlin, who was on his, oh, there he is. No, you're not. There he is. And he's very appropriately wearing his Somerville Pride t-shirt. Thank you, Matt, for joining us today. He's a new alderman as well, so he's going to learn a lot about the ward he's representing in a way he never knew possible. He thought he knew everything. I also just want to mention, I didn't before, for those of you that didn't know this already, this is part of Preservation Month, this tour. We do a lot of different events during this month of May, and we've actually slipped into June because we have scheduling problems. So. And there are other events that are yet to come up that we haven't already done. There's a historic bike tour at the beginning of June. And there is also a preservation award ceremony this Thursday at the Armory, where we award 12 different owners of houses in the city an award for the work that they've done on their properties on the outside. We have this very same library. We'll be doing a talk. Christy is one of the 3 people actually there giving a talk about researching your house and your family background. It's a great way to find out some tips about how to do that and the resources you can use. And then we're talking before the vets tomorrow on Tuesday, actually, as well. Seems like I'm forgetting one other event. But in any case, I've left over here some more paper for you to take. It's also all online, so you don't have to do that if you don't want to. The calendar, the bike tour, and the other flyers as well. So help yourself to any of those documents over there. And I hope you'll join us at some other Preservation Award events, Preservation Month events coming up.
Okay. All right, follow me. We're standing here so that we can get a good look at the former Winter Hill Garage. And I just want to mention that Somerville retains quite a bit of evidence of the early automobile age in terms of garages, in terms of commercial buildings that sold early automotive-related items like tires, and this, you know, is kind of like, even now, sort of like ho-hum. But the further we get away from this early automotive age, 1900 to 1925, the more important it becomes to retain buildings like what we're looking at across the street. The Winter Hill Garage begins in 1907, and it's an interesting brick building that is composed of several different segments, and you can see where there's a lot of infill brick, where that was once open as either a way into the building or perhaps a large showroom window, and then some quite nice cornice detail using ornamental brick in a way that you don't often see on utilitarian buildings like this. So this was a company that was founded by Albert and Robert Michie, or Michie, and they owned this until at least the early 1940s. And so this is a reminder, a link with Somerville's early automobile age. Welcome to Gilman Square. Over in this direction, there was a train station beginning in 1840 on the old Boston and Lowell line, which began in 1836 and started out being primarily freight. But the introduction of the railroads really shaped Somerville and encouraged its independence from Charlestown, because not only did you have the Boston and Lowell line coming through, but also on the other side of the line of hills, Spring and Central and Prospect Hills, you had the Fitchburg line, which parallels Somerville Avenue, which was also important and came in the late 1830s with passenger service by the early 1840s. So in the case of, this would have been the old Boston and Lowell line. So this is where the Green Line extension is going to run through, over here on the right, and there will be a Green Line station here. So in the beginning, there was a wooden train station, which also had housing for the station master. So half of it was the station master's house, and half of it was the waiting room for the train station. And then in the late 1880s, 1888, you had these beautiful rock-faced granite train stations getting built here, and also further, I guess it's southeast, at the intersection of Washington and Joyce Street in East Somerville. So, and the other thing to think about is that even though you had passenger service here as early as around 1840, Gilman Square, the commercial aspect, and even the residential aspect, did not take off right away, and that is because the predominant landowners here, Charles Gilman, for whom the square was named, Otis Tufts, and Rufus Stickney, they held on to their land. And just about the time when they seemed to be starting to thinking about subdividing and selling off, something called the Panic of 1873 occurred, the economic downturn that was nationwide and affected commercial and residential building. And the recovery from that really didn't happen until around 1880. And then finally, after 1880, then you have Gilman Square starting to come together as a commercial, institutional, as well as residential quarter, with the Stone Railroad Station in 1888 really signifying that it was well on its way. And across the way, there's a great image of what Gilman Square looked like when it still had all its buildings. Across the street, there's a gap where the Stickney building was located. And Rufus Stickney was significant because he was a great manufacturer of mustard and spice. And his mustard spice company was located down in Sullivan Square on Spice Street. That street that runs off of Washington and Sullivan Square is a reference to the spice that was involved in his mustard factory. And Rufus Stickney owned a lot of land on top of Winter Hill. Blocks of red brick row houses went up on his land on Central Street. So, you know, there are some missing components here. There was a commercial building over where the playground is, over across the street, where the Somerville Citizen, the newspaper, was located. So the fact that there was a newspaper headquartered in Gilman Square was very significant and spoke to its importance. What does remain is across the street, the Knights of Malta building, which was built in 1896, and it was built to house a charitable organization. Now, the Knights of Malta are a very ancient charitable organization that go back to 1085 AD on the island of Malta, which is midway between Sicily and Tunisia. And the Knights' function back then was to protect European pilgrims on their who were taking part in the Crusades to the Holy Land, seeking out the holy Christian places of the Middle East, and they were protecting them. And then over time, the Knights of Malta turn into something along the line of the Knights of Columbus or the Shriners or something like that. And so by the mid-19th century, all across America, you had Knights of Malta organizations, and a commercial institutional block like this would have had a meeting hall that might have taken up 2 floors, or had a meeting hall that went up 2 stories within. And then you see up at the top, there's what looks like a crusade, like a Knight of Malta protecting the Crusaders up there in high relief in galvanized iron. And then you've got this really great example of a classical revival building. The classicism is more evident as we get further down to the entrance that's down at that corner. These arches atop the 3rd floor window that are not Richardsonian Romanesque arches, but a little bit narrower and more pinched and coming more out of classical tradition. And so the yellow brick, early use of this, by the way, 1896, but in the, riding that wave of lighter materials, and then red brick for the side and rear facades using the perhaps a little bit cheaper material. So why don't we walk down and do you have a...
I'm just going to mention while we're standing here, it's probably a good crossroads to look at, and if you want to take pictures, because this area is going to go through a lot of changes. This is the transit station area that I talked about before, Gilman Square. So just an example of one of the changes you can witness right now is the building that we were just talking about, which used to be the Paddock Restaurant. For those of us that have worked at City Hall for a while, that was a restaurant that a lot of people went to. It has now been transitioned into a new place called Sarma's. As several people have mentioned to me on the tour, if you haven't been there, it's a wonderful restaurant. Totally new type of food. It's Turkish, but inside it's a very kind of innovative and different and unique type of space. Very different than the Paddock, which was kind of like a hamburger type of place before. So this is probably indicative of some of the changes that will be occurring in this area.
Okay, one interesting fact that I forgot to mention about the Knights of Malta building is that it was the first home of Fisher College, which is now at Beacon Street and Arlington Street in the Back Bay of Boston. But it starts out here in 1903 as the Winter Hill Business College, and it is in this building until as late as 1939 when it moves over to the Back Bay, where it is to this day, and now has campuses in New Bedford and Attleboro as well as in the Back Bay. So we are looking in this direction across the street at the Reed and Monarch building, which was built about 1929 in this kind of light industrial tan brick, concrete trimmings, a wonderful cast stone lion's head over the main entrance there. This was food company that kind of processed nut butters in there, including peanut butter. And it's a company that actually began in Dubuque, I'm probably mispronouncing that, Iowa, going back to the 1850s when that company provided food for the wagon trains that continued out to California. And somehow it makes its way here. Has a branch here in Somerville, and so this just brings up the point that during the late 19th and early 20th century, Somerville was home to a lot of food-related plants, not just peanut butter, but perhaps most famously pickles, and the food product that we all are reminded of today, marshmallow fluff, which goes very well with peanut butter. So, Somerville is the go-to place for healthy food. And isn't it ironic that so many people now in Somerville are so concerned about healthy food? So, all right.
I do want to answer a question. Somebody asked me about the building that we just talked about, and this building is likely to come down, the Camp Nut Factory. The city actually bought it under the Capuano administration with a vision to think that it could be used as an annex to City Hall. And then it was even considered for a community center. And then when the T got interested in the Green Line extension, we thought maybe for the T could use it. But it looks like that's not going to happen. It hasn't been approved by the Preservation Commission, but I'm being told that it's pretty likely that the T cannot use it and the station will be elsewhere. So just to answer the question that somebody just asked me about that.
Okay, we're looking across the street at the Litchfield block of 1891. And James Litchfield was a Civil War veteran who fought for most of the Civil War and then comes back and starts a grocery business on Leverett Street in Boston. And then in 1885, he moves to Somerville because he sees opportunity here in Gilman Square. And he gets this built in 1891. And this opened to some fanfare, which got him noticed by the, Retail Grocers Association, who elect him an officer shortly after this is built. And, in terms of architectural style, you've got kind of a classical revival column on the first floor. There isn't a whole lot of stylistic detail that jumps out, but up at the top, the encircling parapet has what is called billet work, which is kind of a Queen Anne kind of detail. And you see these header bricks projecting out up there at the top. The short end of the brick is called the header brick. The long side of the brick is the stretcher. And so you've got a little bit of ornamental detail up there. But the purpose of this was to have his grocery store on the first floor with apartment rentals on the 3 floors above. This is the 1904 New England Telephone Exchange Company building, which is presently home to, or partially the home of, Mad Oyster Artist Studios. So what we have here is, again, this turning to the lighter yellow brick with ornamental detail really limited to the lintel courses above the basement windows. I take that glass brick to be a much later addition, and just with really simple cast stone sills and lintels. It's all about the planarity, the pleasing flatness of the surfaces, and then this deep galvanized iron cornice with the brackets. A very handsome building by the architectural firm of Densmore, LeClaire, and Robbins. And so this was built to handle telephone calls. So it was handling 14,250 calls per day in the first quarter of the 20th century. So a busy place in there. Okay, we're looking across the street at 226 Pearl Street. You can't miss that address. And we're looking at the Kemp Nuts factory of the early 1920s. This is the last remaining building. There was one on Skilton Street. It starts off on School Street in Somerville. 172 School in 1913 moves to the Winter Hill neighborhood here in 1917. This is early 1920s, and it's in this kind of industrial German Bauhaus meets vaguely Art Deco. I really hesitate to say that, but it's this utilitarian nut butters factory, with peanut butter being the principal deal here. And let me just read you that one of the advertisements for this company that appeared in the 1927 Somerville Directory, it shows a nattily-attired golfer swinging his golf iron into a tree, causing a large nut to fall on his head. So it's kind of humorous. Kemp's nut products were sold in Boston area chain stores called the Golden Glow Shops. And he manufactured Golden Glow salted nuts and nut candies. And the Kemp Company was in business here in Winter Hill until at least the 1950s. Don't have a clear cutoff date for that yet, but just a really pleasing industrial loft building. With the Kemp insignia resting on the sidewalk there. It was probably on top at one time. We're on Walnut Street. We're back on a rangeway that goes back to the 1680s, but had nothing but undeveloped land on either side of it until as late as the 1840s. So what we're looking at next are 3 of these substantial residences of Somerville businessmen that go back to the late 1850s to late 1860s period. And across the street, we have the William Vesey House of 1859 to 60, which is a side gable Italianate. And this just brings up the fact that the Italianate form of housing is moving away from the Greek Revival form, where the front of the building is the end gable And now you're getting the front door in the center of the long side in Italianate, and you have the gables have what are called return eaves. The gable goes down and comes back, as opposed to the Greek Revival, which is a pediment, which is a full pediment on the for the attic. Okay, who was William Vesey? He was a bookseller. He bought this house from a fellow bookseller from Plymouth County, Mass., who owned this very briefly, just long enough to sell it to Vesey. And one of the things that I love about this is this granite block retaining wall with the heavy granite post. And yes, you know, the vinyl siding salesman has gotten a hold of this, and you know, a lot of the original detail has been obscured, but you still get the basic form and the second floor oriel that's projecting out there, that three-sided projection. And then somebody came along in the early 20th century and added a great sort of half-moon-shaped bowed bay on the corner over there on the right. So it's had some add-ons. So what we have here at 141 Walnut is a mansard-style house of the late 1860s. William Vesey sells the lot here to John F. Eyre, who was a partner in a lumber dealership with a man named Fuller, who lived a couple of doors down. So here's a business partner who wants to actually live a few doors away with somebody he works with every day. And so what you have here is a more intact example of a mansard or Second Empire style building. Second Empire refers to the regime of Napoleon III in Paris. He popularized the mansard roof, the double-pitched roof for the new buildings of Paris that line the boulevards, and then there's this trickle-down effect to this country. And the very first mansard-roofed house in the United States happens in the south end of Boston at the corner of West Concord and Washington Street in 1847. The Deacon Mansion, which is long gone, no longer there. But Boston area has the distinction of the first double-pitched roof called the mansard roof, named after a French architect, Jean Mansart, from the late 1600s. That's when the roof type begins. It's revived in the mid-19th century. I believe this colonial revival porch was added probably in the 1890s. The next family after the Ayres were the McGregors, and McGregor was in the leather business. That's what he's listed in the directory. So that could mean he owns a tannery, or he's got a store that sells leather goods, shoes, or what have you. So McGregor Avenue, which is really kind of an alley, is named after him. And we're going to follow McGregor Avenue just a little tiny bit to look at some interesting Okay, so talk about links with the early automobile age. Here we have a garage from the early 20th century, which was later turned into a cottage. And if you look around to the right, you will see leaded glass windows that speak to the residential aspect of this later. But you have these original garage doors and concrete walls with wooden upper up in the attic, and then next to it is what I take to be a mid to late 19th century barn that relates to a house on Sunnyside Avenue, the next street over. So this is just a curious little picturesque lane that's fun to come upon when you're out walking and looking at buildings. 51 Walnut Street, which is the Stephen Fuller house. That was built about 1861 for the lumber dealer who grew up in the Thompson Square section of Charlestown, and builds this for he and his wife right after their marriage around 1860. And so this is a good example of a side gable Italianate, and you see one of the key features of this style, the use of arched windows that you see in the bays that project out on either side of the main entrance. and you have this projecting bay that sticks out into the side garden. And then you have a picture window that was cut in up on the second floor, I'm guessing in the 1950s. There are historic photos of this in the history room at the Somerville Public Library. And, if you own a historic house and you want to see what it looked like originally, oftentimes the Somerville Public Library will have a historic photo of what your house looked like originally. We're looking across the street at the Kennison Farm compound, and I think this is a good vantage point to be able to see 3 of the 4 surviving houses. The 4th house is at 7 Kennison Road, which is 1 street over. Parallel to Walnut, yes. So what we have here is Albert Kennison coming in 1847 and purchasing a 63,000 square foot tract that eventually would grow to 77 square feet, essentially at the corner of Walnut Street and Broadway. And so he's conducting a kind of dairy business, dairy farm on this property. And so it seems like he starts out in the little red cottage. And if you look at the Martin Draper map of 1852, page 1, there is definitely something indicated on that site, which I think it's this little cottage here with the Italianate bracketed door hood. And then behind it is a house that was moved to that site at some point in the early 20th century from a site as yet to be determined, but a moved house in the back, which I would characterize as late Federal because of the 5 bays along the front and the narrow single 1 or 2 bays at the end gables, and it's a U-shaped house, which you wouldn't know from here, but these are very interesting houses. Also to the right is a more formal, more substantial Greek Revival house at 174, the sort of yellow-green house, which is of interest primarily for its collection of rear ells, one of which I think was part of one of the 3 Kennison barns. There were 3 quite large Kennison barns on this compound, on this property. And 174 on the right was, by the early 20th century, the home of Charles Kennison, who ran the Winter Hill storage business. So he rented out storage bins, or however you want to characterize them, probably in the rear L of that house. And then to the left of the Kennison compound was the Skilton Pickle Works, the Skilton Pickle Factory, which brings up and one of their products was Bunker Hill pickles, and there were other pickle companies like over where Powderhouse Park is today. There was Puritan pickles, right? So this was one of the key products of Somerville back in the late 19th, early 20th. Okay. I'm about to go on.
Okay, so I just want to make a couple of announcements here because we're going to go into Broadway next, and so thanks for staying with us. It gets a little noisier there. I want to ask 2 questions. People that are here from East Somerville Main Street, can you just raise your hand so we have a sense of how many people are members of... Okay, well, we're going to try and increase that number by suggesting that Carrie Dancy is here someplace. I'd like her to come up and talk a little bit about East Somerville Main Street, the program that she's been directing and started, actually, and has done a wonderful job. And so she's going to talk a little bit about it. And I want to remind you all that what we're heading to at the very end is a very lovely reception at the East End Grill, which is on Broadway in East Somerville proper. And Carrie's going to take off shortly to make sure the arrangements are made there. So stay with us. And then also Matt McLaughlin, I mentioned, is a ward alderman, and he's going to share some thoughts about the house he lives on Broadway, which is a 4-decker, and apparently he knows more about it than we knew beforehand. So hold on and keep with us. This is Carrie here.
Wonderful. Cool. So my name's Carrie Dancy. I'm the Executive Director of East Somerville Main Streets, and I have had that privilege for almost 8 years. So this is my 5th tour. I've missed a couple. I missed last year, but I've learned a lot. So when they were like, let's go to Winter Hill this year, I was like, even though it's not our neighborhood, I'm ready to learn something new. So East Somerville Main Streets works to improve the quality of life in East Somerville and Somerville by creating connection, investment, and pride in our main streets, really having the main streets be the hub of the community. Try not to get run over here. So really seeing that business districts are the heart of any community. That's where the community gathers. That's where people meet their neighbors. And so our organization works to improve the business district and improve the overall quality of life. So it's a privilege to work on this tour every year. I have some materials here I'll hand around. We have some maps of East Somerville. On June 1st is the carnival at Summer Streets. This is the 5th annual carnival. We have about 5,000 people come down to Broadway on June 1st every year. It's pretty awesome. And on the reverse, we're going to be doing a placemaking workshop on Cross Street East, where we'll stop in a few minutes to look at the old row houses, but we'll be doing a 3-day workshop the last 3 days in May, Wednesday, Thursday, and a Friday, to re-envision that space and what it could be for the community. And every third Thursday all summer, we're doing community block parties in the amazing new park that you'll see on Cross Street East. So thank you, Brandon. If you could just pass these around to people.
Carrie's being modest. She does all kinds of different events in the area. So I do urge you to think about joining. I think it's only $25 a year still, or what? To join, and there you get notification about all the different things that she's doing. East Somerville is going through a lot of changes. It's had a very rich history in terms of its architecture and its heritage, but it's going through some more transitions, again, because of all the work that's going on throughout the city, but also at Assembly Row, which I'm sure you all know is getting ready for a big opening next weekend, a grand opening, and so that's having a big effect and influence on the whole East Somerville area. It is one area of the city that some people will argue is more affordable than others, and yet it has great housing stock, great bones. So we encourage you to wander around there, and there's a lot of new restaurants going on that Carrie has actually has made a dining destination. She does something in the fall that takes people, the foodie crawl it's called. So again, if you join the organization, you'll get notification about all the wonderful things happening down there and be helping to support a lot of these positive changes that are occurring. So thank you, Carrie, for coming today, and we look forward to seeing you at the East End.
From this vantage point, we're going to be talking about the former church that you can see across the street and over to the left at the corner of Grant Street and Broadway. That is the former Broadway Methodist Episcopal Church, which was organized. That religious society was organized in 1872, and it seems like initially the parishioners met in private houses, and by the early 1900s they were able to build the church that you see up there, which is a colonial revival church. And as far as I can tell, they never got it together to raise the money to build a full steeple. So it's not unlike the story of King's Chapel in downtown Boston, where they spent all their money on the granite block materials and then didn't have anything to build the steeple at the end. So it's maybe a little bit like that story. But what has been in that building since about the late 1960s, maybe people have a more specific date than that, but that is the Elizabeth Peabody House, the Elizabeth Palmer Peabody House, which is a kind of preschool, daycare, however you want to characterize it. And it's an organization that really traces its roots back to 1860, when Elizabeth Palmer Peabody organized the first kindergarten in America, 1860, on West Street in downtown Boston. And for some years it was located in the old West End of Boston. When that neighborhood was demolished in the 1960s, Elizabeth Peabody House came over here to Somerville. So Elizabeth Peabody based her kindergarten on German kindergartens. That's where the kindergarten concept began, with a man named Friedrich Froebel, and she actually went over there in 1867 to study those German schools, and she was many, many things. She was a historian. She was actually considered one of the transcendentalists, along with Emerson and Thoreau. She was the sister-in-law of Nathaniel Hawthorne. She was one of the three Peabody sisters of Salem. And so even though in some ways she doesn't have a direct link with Somerville, certainly her legacy is seen in the Children's Services building over there that continues to this day. Now across the street, directly right in front of us at 257 Broadway, is a local historic district, one building. Somerville is a city that does have one building historic districts. Pioneered it back in the 1980s or so. 1985. And so you're looking across the way at what is now, I believe, a veterinarian clinic. And that is a very handsome example of a mansard-style building with a bit of a Queen Anne porch with those turned posts. We're talking right directly across the street. And the green and yellow building. Green main body painted green with the yellow trim. And you can see where the mansard roof is going by 1877 when this is built. It starts off low slung, having what's called a bell cast profile in the 1850s, and it gets steeper and steeper and more steeply pitched until by the 1870s you get what's called the hip-on mansard roof to give you even more headroom up on that top floor. And this was built for a man who had a small brick-making concern. And I always get his name wrong. It's either Charles Chauncey Holt or Chauncey Charles Holt. There's a Chauncey Street that's now, I believe, called Fellsway West. But at any rate, this brings up the fact that across the street is an entirely different neighborhood from Winter Hill, from East Somerville. This would be the Ten Hills neighborhood, which extends from Broadway all the way to the Mystic River. And it was originally the farm of none other than the Puritan governor, John Winthrop, who in the 1630s establishes a kind of a retreat for himself in Ten Hills. And then over time, you have these very high-profile businessmen who, it appears, didn't really live in Winthrop's Ten Hill house, but owned the land. Folks like Patrick Tracy Jackson of the founding of Lowell fame, folks like Elias Haskett Derby of Salem China Trade fame. That's in their real estate portfolio. And then finally, by the 1840s or so, the man that did stick around, a man whose last name was Jacques or Jakes, he had, I can never pronounce that, but he had quite extensive brickyard that was all in the back there going over to the Mystic River. So that was one of the key places to find brickyards in that city. And then what happens is the brickyard lands just become too valuable that the residential has to get built on them. And so by the 1870s and 80s, the brickyard thing is falling by the wayside, and then you get a kind of a slow march towards subdivision. All right, let's follow. What?
I just want to mention that for those of you that might be confused about the Ten Hills section, which we nowadays more consider on the other side where the closer to the Assembly Square Mall. The reason what's happened here is Route 28 and then the expressway actually bisected the community and basically made it so it was impossible to get on the other side here very easily. So he's going to talk about this as part of the transportation, quote-unquote, improvements that were made in order to expedite transportation, but actually bisected and dissected, if you would, a lot of the neighborhoods in this area in a not so positive way, and so split them off. So most people wouldn't consider this part of the 10 Hills area any longer, but really part of Winter Hill. So just to clarify, I also want to mention that part of this urban renewal that was done is that the good news is that the Elizabeth Peabody house that he mentioned before that's relocated from Boston was because of urban renewal down there in the West End, which was also a rather tragic, and I'm a planner, so I can acknowledge this, that city planners actually put forth and advocated for in the West End, which forced them to leave. The good news is they moved to Somerville into that church that he's just talked about, and we've actually convinced them to restore the church, and they put the clapboard back on there. So it's actually a better building than it was before, and we're pleased about that. So we're heading in the right direction.
Okay, we're now in Foss Park, which was originally called Broadway Park, and it started to come together in the early 1870s, and historically this park was an area of wetlands associated with the Mystic River, and it had a nickname called Happy Hollow, and I don't think there was much happiness involved in this swampy area because it was kind of a mosquito breeding ground. But as we get past the Civil War and developers are eyeing, what's coming next in East Somerville and Winter Hill, and we are almost into East Somerville across the way there, you get the big developers like Seaman Klaus, who owns most of East Somerville north of Broadway. You get him wanting to make Happy Hollow go away. And so he approaches the city, and he gets Mayor Brastow on board to support this idea of having a park here. But others in the city have different ideas, and they say, why should there be a park here? Why not on top of Prospect Hill, which of course comes later in the 1890s. After all, Prospect Hill and other parts of the city have Revolutionary War era historical associations. A Broadway park would not even be central in the city, and Mayor Brastow, who was the early developer of Spring Hill back in the 1840s, he actually loses the mayoralty over this park, and then, as it turns out, after much hand-wringing, it comes about that people around here actually love this park as it's coming together, and they're happy that they have it, and they even have a pond in the center of it, and it's a combination wading pool, and you can rent little boats to row around in it, and it actually becomes a much needed green space in a city that's going to get very densely built up. Half of Somerville's building stock is built between 1890 and 1910. Most of Somerville is built up during that period. So this is in the 1870s, and this park is actually timely to have it come together. It's set out by Charles Eliot, not the Charles Eliot of the Middlesex Fells, which was a conclusion that I jumped to originally, but the Charles Eliot who was actually employed by the city of Somerville as an engineer and who was largely responsible for the setting out of Alewife Brook Parkway later on in the 1890s, early 1900s. This was named after a fallen hero from the First World War, who Private Saxton Conant Foss, who was the son of the New England poet Sam Walter Foss, who wrote the poem The House by the Side of the Road, and was for many years the head of the Somerville Public Library system, and was by all accounts a much-loved man and a much revered family. And so in 1920, this park was renamed in honor of Saxton Foss. So,
Also, for those of you that come here on Patriots Day, this is where we do a Patriots Day celebration every year with a colonial fair. And then we actually have some readings of Paul Revere's Midnight Ride, as well as this famous poem, which is not that famous to most of you here. If you've never heard of it, The House by the Side of the Road, don't feel funny about it because it's not that well known, except locally here by those that know his poetry. But he was very well known. He has 3 volumes of poetry that was actually published over a period of time as well. So Matt, more currently, contemporary, Matt's going to tell us about some of the housing here and his own.
Well, I just wanted to talk about the history of triple-deckers, I believe we were talking about. As we pass Broadway, you will see 2 4-decker apartments, which are 2 of really the only ones I know of in this area. And it comes from the history of triple-deckers and 4-deckers. So I just like to talk about the history. I'm not an expert on the subject, but I did a paper on it, and I stayed at a Holiday Inn Express last night, so I think that I have a pretty good knowledge of what's going on. So yeah, triple-deckers came into existence in Massachusetts about the turn of the last century, and it's believed that it was brought here by French-Canadian immigrants who brought their shipbuilding experience and brought it in the form of houses. We don't know exactly how it got started because there's no famous architect who came up with the idea. It was just a quick and innovative way to get as many people into a place as possible. But at the time, triple-deckers were looked as a step up from tenements and row houses. So as the emergent middle class came from the Industrial Revolution, families would buy triple-deckers, and famously in Somerville especially too, you'd have a triple-decker where you have a generation of each family living on each floor. So it became kind of a family thing that, you have 4 walls, you have windows, which tenements and row houses didn't have. It brought the sunlight in, so it was really a step up for people. But afterwards, it became so popular and became all over the place in places like Cambridge and South Boston and Somerville that people began to see it as a blight, and they attributed a lot of different things. They said that some people claimed it was led to the moral decline of human beings because people were so packed on top of each other. And it was just interesting little things about it became really a class issue that people didn't want a triple-decker in their neighborhood because of all the problems perceived with it. So that period passed, and there became a strong ban on triple-deckers in Massachusetts and in Boston in general, which is why you don't see them as much as you used to. But now it's interesting that the market is turning around. Is this triple-deckers, especially in Boston, that they don't want to tear down and they want to preserve them because of the new zoning laws would prohibit them from having as many units there as possible. So if you tore down a triple-decker, you would have to replace it with a 2-family house, and they want to get as much out of it as possible. So I do think, I thought it was interesting. If you can check it out when you pass by, I feel like the history of triple-deckers kind of gives you an idea of the history of class and issues in Massachusetts in general. I think it's really fascinating, and if you want to read my paper, I'll email it to you.
And also just to say that today, if you didn't notice up at the library, there was actually a Somerville walk going on, affordable housing walk. And one of that is to provide more affordable housing in the city. So this has really come full circle, and that is that triple-deckers do provide a very important type of housing in the Boston metropolitan area. And it does allow a lot of families to stay together. You can move up and down. You can have your family there to take care of your kids and such, and you can actually look after your parents. So it is a very important type of housing in the area, and we do want to preserve it here in Somerville. So.
Okay. All right, let's continue into East Somerville. And we're about to cross what was called or possibly still called the Northern Artery, aka the McGrath and O'Brien Highway. And this is one of the few highways I've ever heard of that's named after 2 priests who were priests here in Somerville back in the late 19th, early 20th century. The McGrath and O'Brien Highway was set out in 1928 over Bridge Street, Somerville Avenue, and Medford Street. And yes, it did provide a more fast and efficient highway connection between the Charles River and the Mystic River, but it also served to wall off the East Somerville neighborhood from other neighborhoods and made it more difficult to cross from one side to the other, and there was less of a blur as to where one neighborhood ended and the other began. So, in some ways, yes, faster and more efficient transportation. In other ways, not real friendly in terms of knitting neighborhoods together. Actually, in East Somerville, which the beginnings of this neighborhood represent the beginnings of Somerville as a separate town in 1842. And so further down in the Mount Pleasant, Mount Vernon, those streets, that's where the early Greek Revival housing is. When you get down this way, this is more the story of the 1880s and 90s. And we're looking here at 181 Broadway, which was built in 1888 for, for Joseph Warren Litchfield. And what this is it's essentially an L-shaped form, very compact, but with all the Queen Anne love of projections at work here, with this very interesting square projecting bay at the corner, 2 stories. And you see the Queen Anne love of a mix of sheathing materials like clapboards with shingles, whether they're scalloped or sawtooth. And then you have this kind of off-center entrance. This is a style that's all about asymmetry. It's popular from about 1880 to about 1910. And this went from being a private residence to a funeral home by the 1920s. And I don't think funeral homes get enough credit for being really the preservers of our architectural heritage, because that's how a lot of historic buildings get saved. If a funeral home starts up in them somewhere along the line. And so this was the Bryant family was the one who had the funeral home here from the 1920s to the 1950s. And interestingly, they start out in Charlestown as early as 1852 over at 15 Austin Street, and then they move out here in the 20s, and they're providing funeral services into the 1950s. More recently, I think late 1990s, this has become an assisted living residence, and it is run by something called CASCAP, and maybe someone knows more about that organization. Cross Street East, looking across at 8 through 16 Cross Street East. These were built about 1880 by a developer named Seaman Klaus, who owned most of the land between Austin Street, further to the east, and Foss Park. And apparently, I think he thought that all the streets on this side of Broadway were going to look like this row. And that obviously didn't come to pass, and there was a great lag between this 1880 row and what actually got built in great numbers, which is to say 2-family colonial revival houses that you see on the streets back here that were built in the 19-teens and into the 20s. And a combination of things happened. The brickyards didn't go away fast enough. There were some more economic downturns. But this is what got built, and you see that there's some nice detail here between the first and second floor windows of the projecting bays. You've got this billet work. There's that term again, the header bricks turned out, and they make kind of a checkerboard pattern, and then the header bricks, or maybe even, well, yeah, they're header bricks turned on their sides up at the cornice level to make a nice pattern. And then here you see the persistence of the mansard roof. And what's ironic about this is that Klaus has the distinction, or maybe it's not so distinctive, of having his building was the very first building to go up in flames at the beginning of the Great Fire of 1872 in downtown Boston, that great conflagration that lasted 3 days in early November 1872. Much of downtown Boston burned from Washington Street to the waterfront. He owned one of those buildings, the first building to catch fire, and yet here he is. He's really wedded to this mansard roof concept, and the mansard roof was looked to as being the cause for the spread of that fire in Boston, that the fire leaped from roof to roof because of the prominence of a roof like that and the sheathing materials in Boston. So here you've got the scallop shingles, the slates looking very much intact. What's missing are the Italianate bracketed door hoods, which can be seen in old photographs of this block. And then just turning our attention to the new park, I know this is the pride of East Somerville now, very recently coming together. Maybe someone who knows more details about the park can speak to that, this park. It opened last year.
Opened last year, and this is a park that we're very proud of. It's actually a relocation of another park because it wasn't in a site that was very environmentally friendly for kids playing and breathing in the air and such. And it's actually pretty innovative. As all of our parks, we actually design it very much with the input from the residents around the area, which includes the youth that are going to use the park as well. It's already acquired quite a positive reputation among the kids in the area, and it's brand new as of this last year. This is the Chucky Harris Park. Actually, as this year, I think it just opened this fall. So, you know, this is more of this is to come. The other park we're not going to see today, but it is actually closer to the highway, and therefore not a very good location for a park.
Okay, one of the properties that we've recently surveyed is right across the street at 160 to 164 Broadway, the Joe's Liquor Store building, which starts its life without the current first floor. In other words, the wooden upper 2.5 stories were at ground level to begin with. And they were built at some point between 1885 and 1893 as housing. And around the corner is a pretty much identical row that was part of the development that belonged to the developer, Samuel Langmaid, and Langmaid Terrace Apartments up Winter Hill on the north side of Winter Hill, almost to the top, which is a beautiful Queen Anne red brick row, now famous for the fact that President Obama lived in Langmaid Terrace when he was going to Harvard Law School. But this is Samuel Langmaid doing something more modest with these houses that you see this progression of polygonal bay windows, these angled bay windows, and then up at the top this march of shed-roofed dormers. And then in the 1920s, this was hoisted up onto a commercial new first floor. And this brings up the fact that raising buildings up is very common practice in New England in the late 19th and early 20th century. And so they did that so they could get, you know, maximize their investment and run out commercial spaces.
How'd they do it? A huge crane?
Well, good question, but they did. It was an engineering accomplishment, but they did. Where was the entrance? Well, there were individual entrances. Like it was like 4 row houses. Okay, and I just want to see if I can speak to, you know, who was living there in the early 1900s. There were clerks. There was a teamster who worked in Quincy Market. There were hardworking folks that lived here. Someone who was associated with a laundry. And then by the mid-20s, the commercial tenants included David Larkin's Dry Goods, Joseph de Gerlotta's Provisions, O'Keefe's Groceries, the Adams Brothers Confectioners, the corner candy store. And then there were professional offices for a dentist. And this also brings up the fact that as you get on into the 19th and early 20th century, the neighborhood is Irish, it's Italian. Today we have representatives from the South American communities, Brazilian. A melting pot to be sure here in East Somerville. Also want to mention the fire station over here, the Broadway fire station. Which was firehouse engine number 2, and you're missing the full effect of what originally went on here. This building had a kind of, not really a campanile tower, because a campanile would be freestanding, but it had more of a Florentine early Renaissance look to it. If you're familiar with the Pine Street Inn building that used to be a fire headquarters, it had a tower that looked very much like that. You can see it from the Southeast Expressway. It had more of a Florentine tower going on with it. And that tower wasn't just for historical referencing. It had a practical purpose. It was a hose drying tower. Right here on the corner. And it went up to something that looked like something that you'd see in the center of Florence, like the Palazzo Vecchio or something like that. And today this is a senior center, and it has youth services in the building. And it was more apparent that this was a good example of an Italian Renaissance revival building. But it certainly has a lot of nice details, starting with the brickwork on the first floor and the arched openings that were originally the arched opening for the fire trucks to go in and out of. So let's continue. Okay, we talked at the beginning of the tour about early automotive history. Here's a prime example across the street, an automobile storage facility right over here of 1914, which, among other things, featured a pickup and delivery service, a gas pump, and waiting rooms. The original owners were Arthur N. Park and Fred R. Curtis. The structure had space for 40 cars, a machine shop located in the basement, 2 500-gallon gas tanks, a car rental business, and also a showroom for Ford, Marmon, and Marathon cars. So that was a pretty busy little building over there. And again, from 1914. So really early in the story of automobile ownership, because 1915 is the year that Henry Ford starts his mass production of the Model T car. So here, this is 1914. So Somerville is in the forefront of this early embrace of the automobile. Okay, I would be really remiss if I didn't say something about the Ursuline convent that used to be located off in this direction, a few blocks north on top of Mount Benedict. That was a convent that was started in 1820. The students were taught by Roman Catholic nuns, although the students themselves were largely drawn from Protestant Unitarian families. And what happened was, in 1834, there was rising anti-Catholic feeling in the Boston area, and this fear that the Pope in Rome would have an outsized influence on the way America governed, and there were all kinds of misinformation and bad information. And so things came to a head when a group of Yankee Protestant farmers gathered one evening to descend upon the convent, which was up on a hill which has since been cut down, Mount Benedict. And the nuns and their students had a little bit of warning that something was brewing and they better run over to a neighbor's house to stay. But the mob descended upon the convent and almost completely demolished it, left ruins. The ruins stuck around well into the 19th century, well into the 20th century. That area back there was called the Nunnery Grounds, what's now the States Avenue section. So, you know, there's a lot more that could be said about that incident, but, you know, that always needs to be mentioned in any East Somerville history walk. Okay, now we're looking over here at the East Somerville Branch Library. This is one of 3 Andrew Carnegie funded libraries. All 3 of Somerville's libraries were funded by the steel magnate Andrew Carnegie, Carnegie, I always miss, all right. So, right, well, he's long gone, so, and his castle in Scotland was the site of Madonna's wedding. So, okay, just to let you know. So, so anyway, my point is that Carnegie, before he makes the jump from Scotland to Pittsburgh, he credits becoming a great businessman to the fact that as a poor child, he had access to the wealthiest family in town's library. And so he wanted to give other poor children and adults that advantage. And so in the 1890s and early 20th century, he embarked on an absolutely amazing show of largesse, funding American libraries as well as libraries in Britain and Scotland, financed just about a little over 1,000 libraries in the Western Hemisphere, in the Western world, let's put it that way. And so this is one of them, and it's a classical revival building. We're not seeing too much detail from this vantage point, but there's a range of Ionic capital pilasters across the front of it, and it's this boxy rectangular building which comes along just as the 2 families in the back here are underway or finishing. So it's very timely. It's also coinciding with the early automobile thing where people could drive right up to the library and drop their books off and jump into the car and do their shopping.
I do want to mention why it is that we can't stand in front of the library, because I'm sure people are wondering why the sidewalks are all turned up and why things are such a wreck here. The good news is this is all part of a planning project that the city is very much behind, working with the neighbors. This is a couple-year planning process that we've gone through, and this is basically to make major improvements in East Somerville. Broadway, as you probably gather, is a very wide street, a boulevard even, which is good if you want to get traffic coming through very quickly. But this is an example of what some might call a transportation enhancement, because we want to slow down traffic, because the residents that live here want to be able to walk across the street, enjoy the neighborhood that is now very much coming back. So what we're doing is narrowing this roadway so that there will be bike lanes in here. It will be easier to cross. There will be more street trees and benches and street lights and all kinds of things that planners like myself like to see, that we think enhances the neighborhood quality of it here. So this is very much on the works right now. But come back in another couple of months, it'll be all done. I think you'll enjoy walking along here and seeing what this area is now becoming. We have a storefront improvement program that's also going on here that's very much going to be working with the various different business owners here to upgrade some of the facades. And one of the ones that we have done is the East End Grill, which is where we're going next. You might also look across the street, and that one has also been done. So we're making a lot of progress. This is, again, working with East Somerville Main Street program. Carrie, who was here before talking about it, has been instrumental in working with these business owners to enhance the design. And we have one of the members here that's on the design review committee for East Somerville, I think. So thank you for the work that you've been doing on behalf of the residents over here. So we hope you will come back over time and sort of see how these improvements have worked out and whether or not these are really our enhancements as opposed to the Route 28 and Interstate, which bisected the communities from each other. Okay? Yeah, so this is happening all over the city because we're actually making these kinds of improvements on Somerville Avenue. If you haven't been down there as well, we've done a lot of that kind of work down there as well. So thank you.
So thank you all very much for coming out this afternoon. Now we have a wonderful reception across the street at the East End Grill. So let's go over there.